This is the lecture on ancient Egypt, and what I thought I'd do before we get started on the actual history is talk about why we know what we do about ancient history. And what you're looking at here on this first part of the video is the Rosetta Stone. I'm sure people have heard of the Rosetta Stone, at least in terms of software. And if you think about what that software is doing, it's a language program. And the developers of that software actually named their program after this real Rosetta Stone. If you look closely at this, what you'll see are sort of three sections, top, middle, and bottom. And what you've got here are three languages. So the top is hieroglyphics. The middle part is a language called Demotic, which is D-O-M-I-T-I-C. And the bottom language, which is the most important one on here for our purposes, is Greek. And let me tell you a little story about how this is actually found. So in the late 1700s, early 1800s, Napoleon Bonaparte was taking over giant chunks of Europe. And he decided to try and take Egypt from the English. So he sent his navy over, and with his navy he sent archaeologists, historians, surveyors, and as his army was taking over Egypt, he ended up telling his surveyors to go out and survey all of Egypt, and told the archaeologists to bring material back, and so on. And one of the objects they found was this Rosetta Stone, and they realized how important it was because you've got hieroglyphs and Greek all on the same stone, and they realized it was telling the same story. And so the translation of hieroglyphics was not something that happened overnight. It took about 20 years. But of course, because of this one stone, we know all of ancient Egyptian writing. What I've got here is quite a bit of writing on this, and sorry about that. But what I want you to concentrate on, or what we'll concentrate on, is really up through the Old Kingdom. So I'll talk a little bit about the Neolithic period, and that includes the Badarian, and then Naqada 1, 2, and 3. And Naqada, and these are named after geographical places. So we've seen that before. And then I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the early dynastic period. And if you think about what a dynasty means, it means kings. So this is the early period when you've got kings. And then you move into one of the great periods in Egyptian history, which is the Old Kingdom. So it went down to about 2100 BC. And this is also referred to as the Pyramid Age. And then we will end this class by looking at the first intermediate period. And I don't want to go any further in this class, primarily because we just don't have enough time to cover 3,000 years of history in a very short lecture. And besides, what happens in the Old Kingdom really sets the stage for what happens in the rest of Egyptian history. What you're looking at on this slide are some of the burial practices, and these are really important to think about. So you're not just looking at a grave site. What you're looking at is you're trying to figure out what this particular grave is telling us about Egyptian society. So in general, when you look at grave sites in the pre-dynastic period, so what that means is before there were kings, so pre-dynastic, you've got people being buried in pits, and they're just called pit graves or pit burials. And they've essentially just dug a hole, folded up the body, as you can see from this picture, and then they put the bodies in specific orientations in most parts of Egypt during this period. So what you've got, as I put up on the slide, the heads are oriented to the south, and then you've got the faces facing west. And what I want you to do is to turn the video off and to think about why you've got this particular orientation. Like, what exactly is it telling us from pre-dynastic Egypt? And before you shut it off, I'll tell you we don't have any writing. So what you have to do is just make an educated guess. Okay, so really what you're looking at here is we know that later Egyptians worshiped the sun. And they believed that the sun was born in the east, lived out its life during the day, and then died in the west, and then was resurrected in the east again. And so what you've got here, especially with the faces facing west, is that people believed that they would die just like the sun and be resurrected into the afterlife. So again, we have no writing, but when you see a pattern like that, now this didn't happen all over pre-dynastic Egypt, but in many places you've got this particular orientation. And another thing to think about, you've got these things called grave goods. And a grave good is anything but the body in a grave. So in this particular picture you can see lots of pots. And these pots were filled with food and liquid. And so think to yourself or ask yourself, why would you put something like that in a grave? So the answer is people believe that they would wake up in the afterlife and they would need to eat and drink. So no writing, but we can tell just by looking at the grave itself what's happening here in Egyptian society during the pre-dynastic period. Another thing too, you've got early preservation techniques. So it's a little hard to tell from this picture, but this body actually has a cloth laid over it. And these very early burials, they essentially what's going on here is that the sand is desiccating the body. Later on they start playing around with different chemicals, and of course in the high points in Egyptian history, they're taking organs out and preserving them. So far we've been talking about pre-dynastic Egypt. Now let's move into the early dynastic period where you start to find evidence of kings or pharaohs. And this happened sometime between 3200 and 2900 BC. We don't know exactly what's going on here. There's not a lot of writing. We have some visual evidence. And what I want to do is spend a couple of minutes just talking about this particular object, which is called the Narmer palette. And what you're looking at are two different sides of the same object. So it's one object, they just turned it over and photographed the other side. And on your left is considered to be the front. And what you can see here are different registers. So if you look at the top, that's one register. If you look at the middle where the tall guy is, that's the middle register. And then down at the bottom is a third register. And you can see those lines pretty clearly. So let's start with the top. On both sides of this Narmer palette, you've got image of a cow. I mean, I know it looks like a bull, but it's actually a cow. And this is the goddess Hathor. And then in between, you've got a rectangular object. This rectangular object is called a serach. And a serach is really a representation of a house. And who lives in a house? A person. So what the Egyptians have done is they put the name of the character inside of this serach. And it's probably hard to see, but the picture that, or the characters that are here is a catfish and a chisel. And put together these say the name Narmer, or spell out the name Narmer. So that's why this is called the Narmer palette. So you've got Hathor on both sides and then the serach in the middle. Now move down to the center, or the second register. You can tell right away who the main character is here. So, and this is representing Narmer. He is much bigger than other people, and you can see what he's doing here. He's about to club this person who's down on his knees. And down on the knees is a very submissive pose, and you can see the hands that are sort of spread out, palms forward. That's another submissive pose. Right above the character that he's about to hit, if you look at the faces, these two faces are exactly the same. And you've got an eagle standing there. Now that is Horus, so the god Horus. And the god Horus is the protector of the pharaohs. So very early on you've got this god represented as protecting the pharaohs, and he's got a little hook, and this hook is in this person's nose. So another submissive pose. And then off to the far left you've got a little servant who's carrying a wine jug and the sandals of the pharaoh. The last thing to mention about Narmer is to look at his crown. So it's a very particular crown. It'll become much more evident why this is important when we look at the other side. And then look at the bottom register. So here you've got two men down, and if you look at the faces, they're the exact same face as the person who is in the submissive pose just above. And these two are literally under the steps of the pharaoh. So he's conquered them. I know it's really hard to see, but just to the left is a little symbol for a city. So what this is telling you is Narmer has beaten an enemy and he's conquered them. And it's thought that Narmer was ruling in the south. And this enemy, who was maybe another king, is ruling in the north. And now look at the other side. So again, you've got Hathor on both sides with the serach. Just below that, again, it's very clear who the pharaoh is because he's double the size or triple the size of everybody else. And here's where I want you to look at his crown. So it's a very similar crown to the one on the front of the Narmer palette, except this time there's a little curlicue. And so this is thought to be the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, or all of Egypt. And what you're looking at here is a procession, and then to the right of this second register, you can see a line of bodies, and you've got heads between the legs. So this is showing a battle scene. So the front of the palette, he's killing the king or hitting the king. Other side of the palette, the battle is over and he's won. Now if you look at the third register, what you're looking at here are two mythological creatures with their neck intertwined. And what I want you to do is to stop the video and to think about what this might be representing. Okay, what we think this is representing is the Upper and Lower Egypt being intertwined for the first time. And if you notice, there's some little guys who are holding back the necks. It's thought that this is representing how difficult it is to keep these two together. So this is probably a representation of the unification of Egypt. And then down in the fourth register, you've got a bull. Now this time it is a real bull, a male bull, and this is representing the pharaoh. And you can see what he's doing here. He's got his horns, and what they've done is broken into a city wall. And you can see some of the bricks there. And again, just below him, he's stepping on him, the enemy. So it's thought that Narmer was one of the earliest kings that we know of in Egypt. There are others, but more than likely he's the earliest. Now we know a little bit about the government during this particular period, so in this early dynastic period. And one thing I forgot to mention is in this breakdown of Egyptian time, you've got things being broken down into dynasties as well. So the early dynastic period, when you start to find kings, these are dynasties 1 through 3, sometimes just dynasties 1 through 2, because occasionally, especially in the newer books, dynasty 3 through 7 is the Old Kingdom. But as you can see here, the Egyptian state is really something that was given by the gods. So the whole Egyptian state, the whole Egyptian government, given by the gods, and then the pharaohs are divine beings who are put by the gods here on earth to rule. And if you think about it, you've got a deity ruling. Deities are supposed to be good. So it wasn't really rule, but the idea behind a pharaoh is that he's supposed to be a good ruler. So they put here, obliged to rule with truth and justice. And there's an Egyptian word called ma'at, which represents this. And if you ever get a chance to look at the actual names of all of these pharaohs, occasionally you'll see ma'at inserted into their name. And as I put here, one of the chief functions of pharaoh is to keep the Upper and Lower Egypt together. Another thing, they're totally dependent on the Nile. So the Nile floods every single year in the spring, dumps out silt. This is the same thing as what happens with the Tigris and Euphrates, and then you get very fertile land. In the years when you don't have flooding, you can have massive famine. So the pharaoh needs to keep track of the amount of food that's being grown, keep track of the flood size, and then plan ahead. And of course, another thing he does is he's controlling all the trade in the country. Let's take a little bit of time to look at what's happening in terms of cultural links with other people. So we know during the early dynastic period, so dynasties 1 to 2 or dynasties 0 to 2, whatever you want to call it, there are cultural links between the Palestinians and with the Mesopotamians. So we know that the Egyptians tried to put a colony up in Palestine, and really that means that a bunch of people got together, moved up into Palestine, and tried to settle as a city. But that area was heavily populated already, and the Egyptians didn't have very much luck in getting a colony there. But we know that they were there because you can look at archaeology. So there's archaeological finds showing Egyptian material there. And then we also know that they had cultural ties with Mesopotamia. But one interesting thing is that during the Second Dynasty period, so right at the end of the early dynastic period, trade stops. And what you should be thinking about is, how do we know this? Well, we know it because of archaeology. So you look at the archaeological record, you can see there's ties with Mesopotamia, Mesopotamian material in Egypt in Dynasty 0 and 1, and then nothing in the second period, but you still find material from Palestine. So something is going on during this period. In terms of writing, so remember, writing is a very important part of civilization. Early on, you do have some inscriptions, and most of these inscriptions are little name tags. So name tags of a king, almost like these Syrinx, except they're not on a beautiful piece like the Narmer palette. and really nothing on papyrus. Not quite sure what's going on here. Of course, papyrus is made out of plant material, and if it gets wet, it gets destroyed. It's like, you know, a sheet of paper. If you leave it outside for a couple days, it's going to totally disappear. So it doesn't mean they weren't writing on papyrus. It means we just don't have any. I do want to look at the evolution of the pyramid building. And the first stage of this we've already looked at. These are the pit graves. The next style of building that was corresponding to burials is something called a mastaba. And as I put here, mastaba means bench in Arabic because from far away it looks like a bench that you would actually sit on. But all a mastaba is a building that's built over top of a grave site. So people are still being buried under the ground, and then you build this large, was small in the beginning, but larger buildings called mastabas. And these are really storehouses for goods. So these much larger mastabas, later on in the first and second dynasties, have 50 to 60 rooms, and they're packed with food and beverages that the pharaoh would need when he wakes up in the afterlife. Okay, let's move into the Old Kingdom period. So this is probably one of the most important periods in Egyptian history, and it's also known as the Pyramid Age. So it's a really easy thing to remember about the Old Kingdom period. It's when they started building these massive pyramids. And here, so I've given you the dates, 2600 or so to 2100 BC or so. And in older books, the Old Kingdom covers the 4th through the 7th dynasties. But in newer books, you've got the 3rd dynasty included. And we'll talk about this in just a minute of why you've got the 3rd dynasty in general included in the Old Kingdom now. So here's just a map of Egypt showing you the delta at the top and then the Nile down at the bottom. And what you see is a sort of little insert into this map about some of these pyramids. And starting from the top, just to make this easier, I do want to talk about the Khufu pyramid, which is the Great Pyramid. Moving down, I want to talk about Djoser, so just below the name Saqqara, which is where he built his material. And then moving down, I want to talk about the Bent Pyramid, and then the one at the very bottom is called the Meidum Pyramid. First, what I want to do is just talk a little bit about the government during the Old Kingdom. So their capital was in Memphis. So the Egyptians did not have city-states. They had what is called a centralized government, which is where a pharaoh or a leader is living in one place and then ruling the entire country. Now, of course, as I put here, the pharaoh or the king technically owns everything. And I've already talked about Ma'at. We don't need to talk about that again, but remember it's ruling with truth and justice. And then in terms of a social hierarchy, you've got the pharaoh at the top, you've got the literary elites, or the people who could read and write, who are running the administration, running the temples. Below them, you've got everyone else. Now, one thing to remember about Egypt, so you've got a king ruling an entire country. One of the things that ancient people did, and essentially what we do today, is they divide a territory up into smaller parts. Now in Egypt, these smaller parts or states are called nomes. And the person who is put in charge of a nome is a nomarch. So you can think of a nomarch as a governor. So nome is a state, nomarch is a governor. And this is a convenient way to divide up power in a country. As I said, we do it ourselves, but it also can lead to problems. And this is what leads to the breakdown of the Old Kingdom and moving into the first intermediate period, where you've got nomarchs who in general are chosen by the pharaoh. So each time you've got a pharaoh, new nomarchs are chosen. Towards the end of the Old Kingdom, you've got a string of weak pharaohs, and they stopped choosing the nomarch. So the nomarch became almost like a mini dynasty within the nome. So you've got the nomarch, and then his son would become the nomarch, and his son would become the nomarch. And you get a little power build up. And what tended to happen towards the end of the Old Kingdom is that these nomarchs in the north and the south started to break away because they had lots of power and figured they could be pharaohs as well. In terms of the economy in the Old Kingdom, so I've already mentioned this, the pharaoh owns really everything. You do have these large religious states, and these are essentially where the pyramids are. So you've got a pyramid, the land around the pyramid is all owned, and of course these pyramids are dotting the Nile. So all the fertile land is really owned by these religious states, and what happens is if you're a farmer, then you would go in and rent your land, and you would grow your food, and part of your crop would be spent on taxes, which would be paid directly to the temples or the temple complexes. You do find individually owned land. It's kind of rare in the Old Kingdom, but you definitely have it. And the Egyptians are really like us. They take a census. And so a census is primarily done to tell you how much money you can bring in with in your economy. So they took censuses of people, just like we do. We count the number of animals in this country, and they did it in ancient Egypt. And again, it's to show how much food you have this year and how much food will be available next year. And the same thing with crop yields. The United States keeps track of everything that's grown in this country, just like the ancient Egyptians. Now, one thing to remember, in the Old Kingdom, it is not slave-based. So you might have seen the movie with Charlton Heston, with all these slaves building the pyramids. That wasn't the case in the Old Kingdom. The Pharaoh would have people build these pyramids, but they're not slaves. They'd be able to go home when the pyramid was done. And in the Old Kingdom, because it's the pyramid age, what I want you to start thinking about is what that pyramid represents. So of course it's a big building, but it represents religion. It represents the government too, because you need an organized government to build a pyramid. And of course it represents the economy, because you cannot build a pyramid without money. And so during this period we know that trade increased, and then what the Egyptians did with this is they ended up building these pyramids. And the last slide for this first part of the lecture, I just want to show you this chart that I photocopied out of a book. And what it's showing you is along the left part of this graph, it's millions of cubic meters of stone. And then along the bottom, the scale is over time. So if you look at the bottom, you'll see the early dynastic, Old Kingdom, first intermediate period, and middle. And then what you're looking at here is a representation of the amount of stone used during these periods. So you can see in the early dynastic period, a pharaoh named Djoser, who we'll talk about in the second part of the lecture, he builds a step pyramid. So he uses about 0.3 million cubic meters of stone. But then if you move into the Old Kingdom, you can see Sneferu and Khufu and Khafre. They're all using huge amounts of stone to build their pyramid. Now if you look through time, you can see as the Old Kingdom starts to wrap up, fewer and fewer pharaohs are building larger buildings. So again, think about what this is telling you in terms of the economy. And look at the first intermediate period. There's no buildings, no large pyramids built. It's because it's a time of government breakdown. Then the Middle Kingdom starts. It takes a while for them to start building some pyramids, and they certainly do that. But then you can see what happens towards the end of the Middle Kingdom. There are no large buildings being built, and it's representing the problems that the Egyptians are having with the government. So I'm going to stop this part of the lecture because we're at about 24 minutes. And in the second part of the lecture, I want to go into some of the actual pyramids, and we can look at those.